there, gang. It's time, finally. Settle in, get comfy, because we're going to be renecking Mr. Morris. You will remember, we left off with a fingerboard that refused to be removed, resulting in cracks into the neck and an epoxy that didn't want to cure. Absolute worst case scenario. We got to make it right. In this instance, I'm looking to reproduce the original neck fairly closely in its dimensions. I want it to feel pretty familiar in the hand, so I'm going to do things like trace the outline of the headstock and measure it at various points. Here I'm using a profile gauge to transfer the cross-section of the neck at the first fret. I'll be breaking that down into numbers I can work with later on. I'll cut the fretboard extension free and then pop it off. This reveals a dovetail and the Martin-style box beam truss rod, which stopped doing its job. It's completely ineffective. I'll begin with making the new fretboard. This is a piece of well-seasoned Indian rosewood, which I've had for a while. It needs to be planed true and to the correct thickness, which is about 6 millimeters. I'll square an edge on the shooting board. On this I will mark the fret spacing, which I derived from the Stuart McDonald fret calculator. We go out to the machine shed, and I'll install my fret cutting blade and the stiffeners in my ancient table saw. The blade is just 23 thousandths in thickness, which is about 0.6 of a millimeter, so the stiffeners keep it from deforming or wobbling during the cut. I measure the projection above my slotting jig. I want the slots cut deep enough but not too deep, and I count on dialing in their depth after the board is installed and radiused. My jig rides in the miter slots. It has a fence that's set perpendicular to the blade with a line on it. And you can see, to make things more visible on this dark wood, I've used masking tape for high contrast and a very thin technical pen. I just line the fret position markers up with the mark on the fence and push through. The degree of shaking in this shot has to do with harmonic vibration in the camera. It's not like that in real life, I swear, it's not jumping around on me. With this system I can achieve accuracy as good or better than premier factory guitars from the golden period. I'll be making a scarf cut headstock joint, so I'm marking an angled line on my neck blank. I'll saw through that with a Japanese back saw. Then I'll plane the gluing surface flat and true with a block plane. For a good strong joint, this has to be done carefully, so I'm often sighting it with a square, in both directions with a light behind it. A similar angle, which happens to be about 13 degrees, is planed on the end of the neck shaft, and then the two parts are glued together with a whole bunch of clamps. The headstock is planed to thickness, being sure to account for the veneer that will go on later. This dimension can vary a little depending on the style of tuning machines that are going to be used. Then the taper of the neck is planed into its top surface, using measurements taken from the original. Again, there's a bunch of checking with straight edges. I want to make sure this is flat. I'll be gluing in some carbon fiber support rods to stiffen the neck. Here I'm cutting an angle that matches the headstocks on one side of them. These get epoxied into channels on either side of the truss rod slot. These ones happen to be thinner but taller than the ones I usually use, which are 6mm squares. These were about 3mm by 9mm tall. I'll clean off the excess epoxy and remove the tape. If I left it there and clamped this, the carbon strips would end up proud of the surface when I'm done. That's a big messy problem to get flat again. I'll clamp it to a flat phenolic thing which has some waxed paper in between. It's time to saw the neck off. There's a very thick coat of finish on this guitar, and I need to cut that somewhat close to the sides so that I can run my flush cut saw against them and have something to register. This takes longer than you might suspect if you want to do it cleanly. Of course, I try not to run the exceptionally hard and brittle teeth of the saw into the steel of the truss rod. Doesn't always happen. And then finally a little prying and success. A heel profile which is clean enough that I can copy. Interesting feature. There's a strip of wood that was glued into the end of the dovetail, probably to add reinforcement and keep the heel from splitting if it happened to get bashed. I'll trace the outline. The truss rod channel needs a stop at the headstock end. You can see how I carried the carbon up into the transition area where the headstock breaks tend to be nastiest, right behind the nut. I'll glue on the headstock veneer facing, which is a nice piece of rosewood. To keep it in position, I use 2 thin dowels in an area which will eventually be cut away. This way the veneer stays in place and doesn't slip around when I'm trying to get all the clamps on. I'll plane the final taper into the fretboard. Here I'm gluing the heel block into place. The fretboard is ready to glue on. For positioning, I use a couple of strips of wood glued on either side of the board and 2 steel pins, they're actually 16th inch drill bits, through fret slots to pin it securely while I glue it up. I'm using epoxy again. This is one that I've tested to make sure that it functions. I'll pin it in place and wrap it up hard with surgical tubing. The flat end of a Martin-style headstock can be difficult to cut cleanly, so I'm routing it with a straight edge and a flush trimming bit. It's clean! I need to radius the corners, which I'll do by sanding and then filing and then more sanding. At this point I carved the neck to shape, which can be seen in the video Carving in Questions from a few weeks ago. I'll try and put a link in. To keep from blowing out the tuner holes, I've taped and superglued the headstock to a backer block, which will prevent the drill from tearing as it exits. The top bushings fit well, but the shaft housing is still too big and the holes need to be upsized for part of their depth. Something is preventing the neck from seating. The truss rod channel isn't deep enough for this rod, so I'll make a one-time use flush trim bit that's only 1/4 inch wide by wrapping the bit with tape. This will not be super precise, but it doesn't have to be for this application. Just need to deepen things by about 1/8 inch, or 3 millimeters. I'll measure and mark for the side dot position markers, and then drill those out and install them. To reinforce the heel, I'll glue in a length of hardwood dowel. With a tight fit, it can help to saw a relief cut in the side of the dowel to give air a place to escape. Here I'm sawing the heel end cap to rough shape. I'll get that clamped in place and glued on. It's oversized, so there's a moment for some carving. Isn't that a nice sound? After sanding the neck up to 220 grit, I need to dampen it lightly to raise the grain. All these little fibers get pushed down during the sanding process. The water hits them and they plump up and they get kind of bristly, so I can sand them off. Here you can see them in high relief. I want to stain this neck so it matches the body a bit better. I'll make up a water-based stain with trans tint dyes, various browns, Van Dyke, Sienna, Umber, and make it fairly dilute so that I can build up to the tone I'm looking for. Then I'll pat on a coat of shellac to act as a barrier, because I'm going to fill the pores with a paste. In this case, it's going to be standard walnut wood filler, which I'll thin down a little bit with water and also custom tint so it's got the right shade. This dries very fast, so I work in small areas. I just scoop it on, rub it in, and then wipe off the excess. And it will likely take a couple of passes before it gets filled. I can lightly sand back the leftovers on the surface, and then add another coat of shellac. I want the surface sealed before I do the final fit of the neck. It sort of protects things. Here comes the shellac. It really brings out the color. The shellac also acts as a sanding sealer, which is important because the lacquer really needs something to grab hold of. I'll pound in a couple of small frets in the center of the still unradiused board so I can have a proper reference surface for my straight edge. I'm pretty happy with how closely my neck fits in the old outline there. It's satisfying. I'll do some preliminary stock removal with coarse sandpaper, just like a standard reset. But as I get close, I'll transfer the position of the through hole I drilled in the neck block to the end of the heel. I use a carefully concealed color pencil and quick stabbing motions. I use 1/4-20 furniture bolts, which come in a range of different lengths, none of which is ever the right length, so I always end up cutting them off. And they engage with an insert nut I sink in the end of the heel. I use quite a lot of super glue on there as well. Remember, I'm also drilling into the side grain of the dowel inside. But I go back and use thin super glue to really sort of solidify the whole area. Then it's back to the final stages of setting the neck with the bolt holding it in place, doing alternate pulls on either side. In this way I can also tip the neck in one direction or the other to improve the center line relative to the bridge if it's off. I check this with string. I'll tape up the fingerboard and spray on about 6 coats of lacquer. Let's talk a little about neck joints. This is pretty much the simplest possible system, with the exception maybe of just gluing the heel directly on the end of the guitar, which is a thing that has been done. David Russell Young wrote one of the first build-your-own books in the 70s that had people epoxying the neck onto a dreadnought. And you know what? It kind of works. It's not repair-friendly in the usual sense. It's a kung fu neck reset every time, but it works. There's also the integral neck system used in classical guitars, the Spanish heel. That can be more tricky than it looks. You have to get the alignment right, and cutting the binding channels in that area takes kind of a deft touch, but it works too, even for steel strings. Obviously not for a repair. I wouldn't disassemble the entire guitar to put a Spanish heel in. This flat heel and bolt-on method is quite similar to the first generation of Taylor guitars, before Bob got a CNC. It's practical, and in a repair setting, it's pretty cost-effective. It harkens back to 19th century Viennese designs, the Lacote designs, and the How Orme guitars from the turn of the 20th century. A step up in complexity would be a mortise and tenon joint with bolts in it. I don't see any real benefit here, unless you glue it in place. And then, of course, we have the traditional dovetail. Why not do one of those? It had one in the beginning. But like a lot of things in this profession, doing some of these operations retroactively is way more time-consuming and painstaking a task than in the initial construction. Here I have to contend with some really thick finish on either side of the heel, and a guitar that has sort of deformed slightly from age. I can't get in and sand the sides flat in this area without having to strip everything, and fitting it would be extremely annoying. With the flat end of the heel, I've managed to make it fit pretty nicely inside that trough of lacquer, which is far more difficult to do when you're trying to position a dovetail laterally. So this was the obvious choice. Another concession I'm going to make is to use epoxy on the fingerboard extension, because in this case the finish, this polyester, is so thick and the top ply of the soundboard is so fragile that I'm just not willing to try and scrape through all of that to get down to the surface of the plywood. It would also throw off all that hard-won neck angle I've just made. So I've scored up the surface after sanding it to give the epoxy something to really grip onto. We're going to use the same technology they used in Japan, just a little differently. On goes the epoxy. This has a 15-minute working time, which is useful. The 5-minute stuff is for the criminally insane. I also put a little dab of woodworking glue at the end of the heel for extra insurance, just a bit at the very end. It's on end grain, it'll pop free if it ever needs to come apart. I snug up the bolt, get that good and tight, and glue down the extension. This guitar has a useful little bump out on the neck block inside there that makes clamping really easy. And there we go. I even managed to replicate the slight tilt of the heel cap, and it fits very nicely inside the lacquer trough. I've shown a bunch of refrets in the last few weeks, so this should hopefully all seem very familiar. I'm truing up the fingerboard, making it flat from stem to stern. Then I'll use the 16-inch radius sanding block. To install the 5mm pearl dots, I use a hand-powered drill and a brad point bit to cut a nice clean hole. I always start by going backwards. This scores the surface of the board and allows the bit to get in there without causing any tear out. I sneak up on the fit and then use thin viscosity super glue to hold it in place. I make sure the pearl is slightly proud of the surface. It's a lot easier to dress down the pearl than the entire fretboard. While that dries, here I'm just about to cut the individual frets to length using a nipper. When the glue has had a chance to cure, I use some tape as a depth stop and rough down the dots with a file. After which I'll go back with a radius block and sand everything perfectly smooth. I'll recut the fret slots to their final depth. Bonk, bonk on the head, Grups. Bonk, bonk. Give it a squeeze. Clean it up a bit. Clip it off. You know the drill. You may recall the saddle on this guitar was made extravagantly wide, possibly to correct intonation problems, and perhaps to also make way for an undersaddle pickup installation. It's about 200 thousandths wide. It's 5 millimeters. As luck would have it, I did have a chunk of bone big enough to do this. The slot itself is slightly irregular, so I'll use a safe edge file to kind of zhuzh it. The glue in the frets has had a chance to dry, so it's time to level those with the leveling beam. Didn't take very much. It doesn't usually if you're in the process of building a guitar. Only have to remove about 3 thousandths total height to get them all level. So recrowning goes pretty fast as well. I've sanded my nut blank to width, and I'll hold it up against the end of the fingerboard and score down into the headstock facing using the scalpel. Do multiple cuts, and eventually I'll be able to cut right through it. I'll clean it up with a small chisel. I'll cut the nut blank to close to final dimensions. File it to rough shape. Mark the string spacing and the position string to string. I'll start to file the string slots. That just needs some final adjustments when the guitar is complete. I'll hold off on gluing it in until I've had a chance to polish the headstock. Here I'm sanding a radius into the top of the saddle. The lacquer was leveled a couple of times in the spraying sessions, so I can start with 1200 grit paper to get rid of any orange peel texture or little specks. Prepare it for buffing. This is medium automotive compound on a foam pad. I'm not really going for showroom shine here, because the rest of the guitar is so heavily played and weathered. I'm just trying to spruce it up a little bit. Now I'm into finessing the height of the string slots. After that I'll file off excess height. You really only need about half the string's diameter in the nut itself. Then there'll be more sanding and polishing so it's shiny. Without any adjustments, the neck pulled up into a very nice 7 thousandths relief. That'll do. We'll work on the intonation a little bit. Have a look at the intonation points here on this saddle, which, if you remember from the previous episode, this has been widened at some point. It's it's twice as wide as it originally would have been. And I think the bulk of that was positioned towards the back half of the bridge, towards the pins here. I thought maybe to accommodate the undersaddle pickup, but in reality here, this is definitely necessary to get this thing playing in tune. And have a look here. I think we're still in a situation where when the saddle is lowered to its correct height, it's just over 1/8 of an inch now. It's got to come down about a 32nd of an inch. That those windings are going to be up and over top of the crest of the saddle. So that means I've got to put a bridge pad overlay on this one again too, to correct that. Just can't leave it like that. I'm measuring and marking to take off the appropriate amount from the underside of the saddle. Here I'm planing some hard maple to thickness for the bridge pad overlay. This is smaller than I usually make because I have to take into account the entry point for the undersaddle pickup. And the intonation looks pretty sculptural and nice. I like it. Okay. Long, hard slog. And not something I anticipated when going into this 3 months ago. But at the end of the day, a very nice outcome. The action is about 30% lower. The neck is straight. Has a functional truss rod. Though with the 2 strips of carbon fiber, it should stay very stable. It's funny, I was chatting with a group of other repair guys from the Luthalong crew last week, and someone asked about carbon fiber and how much the neck actually moves with the rods in it. And I said that with 2 6mm square rods in a mahogany neck, 14 frets to the body. If I build it and fret it perfectly straight, and then string it up with a set of 12s, it seems to pull into a consistent 6 or 7 thousandths relief every time. And this one bore that out, so I'm pretty happy about that. People are going to ask, is it worth it? And of course the answer is no. No, absolutely not. I re-necked it because things went terribly wrong, and I didn't want to send the customer away with an unplayable guitar, right? Because it arrived with high action, but it was kind of playable. There was a brief instant in time where I should have said, you know, it's not perfect. The high E string is weak, with no pressure on the saddle. It's too low, but that is basically what you get. There was a quitting point there, and I didn't see it at the time. I was Icarus, and Tone was the sun. But it's back together now. Sounds good, plays great. Happy times.